everyone to today's panel, which is all about architecture. And architecture is the theme this year at the Wende Museum. As you might have seen, we have an art installation by Enrique Martinez Zelaya, who rebuilt the house his father built during the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he made a very personal art installation around it that reflects on the connections between history and memory. Then in April we will have the exhibition Mobile Churches, which is about the 7 churches and 1 synagogue that were removed from the city center of Bucharest, put on the rails, moved out in order to make place for the People's Palace under Ceausescu. And right now we have the exhibition Intersections, the architecture of Victor Adebite and Charles Poloni in Ghana, which was organized and co-curated by Lucas Steinek, who's one of our speakers today. And I think we never focused so much on architecture before, but I think there are lots of reasons to do that. First of all, because architecture more or less combines everything in it at once. It has this artistic aspect, it has science, it has philosophy, it has political implications, and it directly interacts with society at large. Today's panel, Geopolitics and International Modernism in Architecture, is in conjunction with our Intersections, our Ghana exhibition. And it will be a challenge, I think. We have, not because we don't have 4 really amazing speakers, but because the topic is a little bit tricky in the sense that modernism in architecture has so many definitions. Can be approached in an aesthetic way, in a more functional way, can be considered to be something neutral or meant apolitical, or it can be the carrier of ideology. Also, there are heated debates about the question whether modernism in architecture and modernism in general is a utopian project or a dystopian fiasco. So all of those questions and many more might come to the table today. And yeah, I'm very happy to introduce our guest speakers today. Let me start on the other side of the floor with David Rui. David starts from the premise that what we take to be reality is largely built out of representations, including buildings, images, interfaces, and stories. This insight has informed both his design practice as an architect and his theoretical writings, with a special focus on emerging creative technologies. He's on the faculty of SciArc in Los Angeles and currently helps develop an architectural curriculum in Shenzhen, in China. Next to him we have Susan Horowitz, and Susan is an artist and curator based in New York and Los Angeles, also a dear friend, I have to add, whose documentary projects explore modernist architecture, urbanization, architectural tourism, and preservation. She has organized several exhibitions and produced several video documentaries. I want to mention one, New York Post, which is a really beautiful and poetic video about New York during the pandemic. And I recommend it for everyone to have a look. But there is also her video Reconsidering Architourism, and you will hear and see more about that in a minute. Then we have next to Susan Lucas Steinek. Lucas is a professor of architecture and urban planning at the University of Michigan, and the author of Henri Lefebvre on space, architecture, urban research, and the production of theory, as well as architecture in global socialism, Eastern Europe, West Africa, and the Middle East in the Cold War. And it was that last book that actually brought us together and that ultimately motivated the current exhibition. Lucas has created several exhibitions. I want to mention The Gift, Stories of Generosity and Violence in Architecture, and of course our current Intersections exhibition, and I'm sure we will hear more about that as well. And then last but certainly not least, next to me is Joe Day. Joe is an architect and theorist in Los Angeles, where he leads the Deegan Day Design LLC and serves on the Design and History Theory faculty of SciArc. In both his design and writing, Day examines the intersections of contemporary art, urbanism, and architecture as visual disciplines. His book, Corrections and Collections, Architectures for Art and Crime, which, by the way, is available in our gift shop, just a hint, was discussed at the Wende in conversation with architectural critic and longtime presenter of KCRW's Design and Architecture, Francis Anderton. He serves on the board of trustees at SciArc and as a director at the Keck Foundation. So please give my speakers, our speakers, a warm welcome. We will start with three short introductions by Lukáš, Susan, and David, followed by panel discussion and then Q&A with a reception afterwards. And before I hand it over to Lukáš, I also want to give a shout out to our events and programs manager, Rachel, who organized everything behind the scenes, as well as our amazing visitor engagement team. Clara, our video, she does the video recording of today's panel, and Malik, who jumped in last minute to take care of the audio. Thank you all so much. And with that, Lukáš, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joes, and thank you for having me. As Joes mentioned, I'm the co-curator of the Intersections exhibition, which studies the collaboration between the Ghanaian architect Victor Adegbite and the Hungarian architect Charles Polony in 1960s Ghana. Ghana at the time was a really important place. It was in world politics. It was the place in a country that was the first African country to be independent from a European power. And so it got significant visibility worldwide. This exhibition builds upon research that was first communicated by means of this book on the right, Architecture and Global Socialism. The book focused on the collaboration between architects, planners, and construction companies from the socialist countries and their counterparts in the newly independent countries in Africa and Asia from the late 1950s to the 1980s. And it shows how this collaboration shaped 5 cities, including Accra in Ghana, but also Lagos in Nigeria, Baghdad in Iraq, and 2 cities in the Gulf, Abu Dhabi and Kuwait City. And so you might wonder about the selection of the cities, and Ghana is perhaps understandable. Under the first president, Kwame Nkrumah, the country moved towards socialist development, and hence the relationship with the Soviets and the satellite countries was understandable. But that was not the case with the other countries. And yet, Eastern European architects and Chinese architects traveled to these countries, and with them traveled other things, including architectural designs and building technologies and materials and standards, and so on. This was because the governments of Nigeria, for instance, or the United Arab Emirates were interested in offsetting the shortages of professional labor, and they were interested in stimulating the competition between foreign actors in their countries. And so accordingly, what really unites these 5 cities is that all of them were opened towards a multiplicity of architectural networks. There were architects and other actors from the capitalist countries, from the socialist countries, from the non-aligned movement, and also from other newly independent countries. And that was very much the case with the 2 protagonists of the exhibition, Victor Adegbite and Charles Polony. Adegbite and Polony worked at the main institute, main design institute in Accra, the Ghana National Construction Corporation, which were Adegbite was the chief architect, and Poloni was one among several Eastern European architects who were working there as part of the socialist technical assistance to Ghana. That included architects from Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, but also a few architects from Asia and at least one African-American architect, namely Max Bond. And here you see some of the buildings that they together designed in Accra. And so one could ask, why is that relevant? Why is this story relevant? I believe it is relevant because it changes our understanding of how modernism became worldwide. The conventional story is that the modern architecture was somehow diffused from Western Europe and after World War II from North America. By contrast, this research and the exhibition evidences how modern architecture was a result of a multiplication of connections, of a multiplicity of networks, and sometimes the antagonisms between them. And when you look at architectural work in this context, you see that what also changed was the way how architects worked. And so architects had to negotiate this multiplicity of resources that were coming from a variety of directions, including architectural design, standard designs, materials, and technologies. And this is what Adegbite and Poloni did. And we argue, for instance, in the exhibition that buildings such as the one you see on the left in Accra was very much building upon the previous experiences in Hungary and in South America, which were then adapted by Poloni and Adegbite to the conditions of Ghana, to the local conditions, to the technical conditions, social conditions, financial conditions. And so it was a moment of enthusiasm, but it was also a moment of risk, and that enthusiasm and that risk are in the focus of the exhibition.
Rather than describe exactly what I do as an artist and a curator and a director of preservation projects, I thought it would be really more forceful to show you one of my most recent videos, which is called Reconsidering Architecturism. And I know it's a fraught term, but this is designed to give you the spirit and some of the experiences and the overwhelming information that you take in as a traveler, trying to understand the world through the lens of architecture. In the traumatic year all global travel and tourism ceased, the last trip freezes into focus. An abrupt pause to architecturism, constructing an archive, exploring the complexity of attraction to place and cultures, encounters with sites, archaic to modern, connections across the world, as readings, references reverberate, architectural history, literature, journalism, film, art, archaeology, focusing on capturing impressions on the run, contrast between the vernacular and the extraordinary, perspectives to reflect this fortunate chain of travel experiences. Sensing the essence, images and ideas linger. Regret for sights unseen, impulses to get involved. Resolving to delve further while reluctantly leaving. You are the map. The last trip. Architecturism, some 20th century architecture. India and Sri Lanka, evidence of global influences. Architectural thought, Le Corbusier's visions for the urban modern world. The flux of architects traveling back and forth,
cultures, concepts, styles, methods, materials, opportunities to build the new architecture in tropical ecologies, modernism, dauntingly handmade, places with complex histories, pre- and post-independence. Cultural heritage, UNESCO World Heritage designation for India's Le Corbusier Chandigarh Capital Complex and Mumbai's Art Deco. Tentative list for Chettinad's Victorian to Art Deco villages. Fraught UNESCO politics. 1930s Pondicherry, Golconda, India's first concrete modernist building, an ashram dormitory. Sri Lanka, focus on under-the-radar architect Geoffrey Bowa's innovative urbane fusion of organic modernism with tropical vernacular, all reflecting collections of architecture facing issues of conservation and the positive and negative effects of cultural tourism. Views facing the future, cultural travel now, after the devastating, isolating world pause. Contemplating new conditions, new barriers, uncertain starts, stressed resources, trepidations. Yet, ideas and desire build to explore perspectives from this unusual period of time, to add to the archive. Architourism.
Thank you. David, please.
You'll have to excuse me, it's a tough topic, so I had to write it out a little bit to gather my thoughts. So first, thank you, Joes and Wende for organizing this. It's a privilege to be on this panel, especially in the singularly unique museum that documents the complex legacies of the Cold War. I don't know any other collection quite like it in the world. For a long time now, I've been preoccupied with the way representations, pictures we make, buildings we make, stories we tell, don't just depict the world, but construct it. We tend to assume that reality comes first, and the creative arts arrive afterward to express it. But I think the opposite is closer to the truth. A building is not a mere representation of a society. A building is one of the primary ways a society becomes real to itself. And I noticed chapter 1 of your book, you said world-making architecture. This is why architecture was so strategically useful during the Cold War, and why I think it remains strategically useful today, even if the geopolitics have shifted. Architecture doesn't just symbolize political power. That's the normal narrative. It doesn't merely symbolize, but it also produces the reality in which political power becomes legible. When the United States promoted modernist architecture abroad in the 50s and 60s through art exhibitions, State Department programs of embassy building, for example. We all know that famous photograph of the Durell Stone Embassy in Saigon while we were leaving, and large-scale development by the first multinational corporations as well, abroad. It wasn't just decorating American foreign policy. It was constructing the perceptual environment in which American values appeared self-evident. The Soviets understood this well, and which is precisely why they also invested so heavily in their own architectural exports, as Lukash's research so vividly makes clear. Now, here's where I think the story gets a little more interesting and more relevant to where we are today. The conventional critique of international modernism is that it erased local identity, that it bulldozed the genius loci in favor of universal rationalism. That's generally the typical critique of modern architecture's failures. And there is some truth to that. However, I think that critique has also obscured something important, that visual abstraction, the set of aesthetic operations at the core of modernist design, was never actually neutral or universal. Formalism, which is a hard word to debate because it's been used in so many different ways. Formalism was as much a political device as it was a disciplinary or art historical phenomenon. It was an instrument deployed in a cultural Cold War as well, and deployed by both sides, and the fact that it appeared neutral was precisely what made it so effective. I've been working on this neglected history recently with the historian and theorist Mario Carpo for an upcoming publication, and I'm frankly astonished by how much material is there that has been underdocumented. Tracing how formalism moved throughout the 20th century as a quiet carrier of ideologies. From Russian formalism and constructivism to Clement Greenberg's championing of abstract expressionism, to the way corporate modernism became the default visual language of global capitalism, formalism kept changing hands without ever fully disclosing what it was carrying. It looked like style, but it functioned as strategy. So what does this mean for us now? I think we're living through a moment that bears uncomfortable resemblance to the mid-20th century, more than we might be comfortable admitting. The geopolitical competition today between the United States and China still engages soft diplomacy as a primary vehicle. But representational technologies have changed, and there are many more pathways for soft power and diplomacy. We're no longer just building modernist towers as symbols of progress. We're also building comprehensive virtual environments as well. That is social media, streaming content like Netflix, shopping platforms like Amazon, that construct reality at a scale and speed that Cold War actors could barely have imagined. The question I'd like to put on the table for the discussion is this. If modernist architecture was one of the great representational technologies of the 20th century, a machine for making certain political realities feel inevitable, then what are the representational technologies doing, and which ones are doing that work now? Is it still architecture? And is creative practice and creative practitioners sufficiently attentive to how its work is being deployed strategically by others? Or has this ground already been surrendered to the technology and media industries and its marketing apparatuses? I think the Wende as an institution is uniquely positioned to help us think about this, because it takes seriously the idea that cultural objects are not mere illustrations of past history. They are unconscious mediators of political perception. I do think this is as true today as it was during the Cold War. Okay.
Thank you very much. And Joe, I'm going to include you in a second, but before I do so, I want to ask one question inspired by listening to the three of you. And that is that it seems to me that there are different power structures involved in the internationalization, the globalization of modernist architecture. You could maybe distinguish the power politics of soft diplomacy on the one hand versus the grassroots approach of architecturism on the other. And this is actually a question for all four of you. How do you see the balance between this top-down and bottom-up approach of the internationalization of modernist architecture?
Yeah, a very hard question. Very hard question.
That's why I start with
Yes.
it.
I think, one of the things that's interesting is to look at our embassy program, our current embassy program of new embassies across different countries, and compare it to the embassy program that we had more in the Cold War period, where transparency was the object of the modernist architecture that was commissioned, and now it's security. So the embassies are being put in much more remote places where they're using excellent modernist current architects, but you can't access them. And the older buildings are becoming maybe relics of modernism. So I see that as one of the geopolitical differences.
And Lukáš, I think in your research and in your book, and also in our exhibition Intersections, there are some interesting examples of contradictions between political programs that initiated certain projects and then the reality on the floor where individual architects responded with their own ideas and sometimes couldn't care less about the ideological underpinnings. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yes, absolutely. So I think this is an interesting avenue of this research, which shows that there were these large-scale political and economic motivations by both the countries that were sending architects and the countries that were receiving them. And again, my selection of the cities points out at the variety of these motivations, right? From the ones that would be on the side of political ideology and the implementation of a socialist development model, like it was the case in Ghana and to some extent in specific periods of time under the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. But then there were those other motivations that, broadly speaking, included the stimulation of competition among foreign actors and the attempt to, for example, fill in the shortages of professional labor that in a post-colonial context was where there were significant shortages, and so this is the broad motivation. But then the architects came quite often with their own ideas, with their own also motivations. And I think our exhibition is a really good case study of that condition, where neither Poloni nor Adek-Bite were proponents of socialism, right? Adek-Bite, and I know this from his archive, was very careful, even in his very exposed and prominent position in Accra in the 1960s, not to make very broad ideological statements, And Poloni was somebody who traveled to Africa precisely because he was not a proponent of the of Hungarian socialism. He was not a member of the Communist Party. For him, it was a way to develop a career while being still in touch with the country. In other words, another option was to emigrate. And many did. But because of family reasons and other types of loyalties, he decided that that was, if you like, the middle way for him to work as an architect and to come back repeatedly to Hungary, but without a commitment to the system. So I think in these two, in the personal and biographical trajectories of these people, we see very well how they tried to negotiate the demand from their respective governments with their own personal and professional ambitions.
And David, you mentioned the reality shaping aspect of architecture, but also you could say the virtual reality shaping aspect of social media, etc. What do you think changes in that transition in terms of power versus agency?
One thing that is unique to emerging virtual platforms is it comes up from the bottom a lot more. Like, for example, let's take Reddit, for example, as a platform. It has a kind of, perhaps an illusion that it's all community-based and people just organizing themselves, and the discourses that spontaneously arise out of it are unpredictable, emergent, so on. However, there is a company up top that can keep kind of uncanny tabulations of numbers of people, where the IP addresses are coming in, where they were previously, what else they were looking at that day. So it's if you maybe have other interests in mind related to power, it's practically a dream come true to be able to surveil participation and community making under a kind of illusion that it's all free space when it's actually not. This is, I think, an interesting thing to contrast maybe with physical space as we have known it. Sure, we don't like the security guards telling us to stay off the grass and so on, or the surveillance cameras, where we feel like our liberties are somewhat compromised. But at the same time, it's an altogether different logic in the online world. So both, I think, are powerful because of how unconsciously it does its work. So in that respect, I don't see them as different things, but one is certainly a lot cheaper than the other, which is a factor, I think.
Yeah. And speaking about surveillance, Joe, that actually brings me to your book, Corrections and Collections, which draws a very surprising, but at the same time very convincing parallel between museums and prisons. And you have a lot of examples from the modernist tradition there. And one of your arguments is that these parallels have to do a lot with vision, with who sees what, who sees whom, who oversees people, who has the power to see. And it would be great if you could give us some insights in what kind of parallels you draw between prisons and museums, and what the implications are for power structures behind museums and prisons.
And am I on? Use?
I think so, yeah.
Hughes, thank you so much for including me today. My involvement here really grew out of a conversation we had a few weeks ago, and I'm thrilled to be here and grateful to Justin and Jean-Paul as well. And the Wende is such an incredible place, so I want to add my thanks there. And you were incredibly kind to kind of showcase corrections and collections, architectures for art and crime, which does actually touch a bit on the internationalization of both there's been enormous proliferation of both building types over the last 40 years, and that has transnational dimensions that I think are interesting. The last chapter is probably the closest to where we are today. And I would add to, say, the embassy program as a kind of cultural export. Art fairs are certainly, and we have Frieze around the corner here as an example. The degree to which internationalization and the idea, and it's become a surprisingly contentious one, the idea of a kind of cosmopolitan shared cultural currency, which all of a sudden seems, to my mind, imperiled, I think is part of how culture moves around in the world. And I think, used to your question, it's part of how we start to enter a kind of utopian dimension, the discussion of possible futures, which seems so important in any discussion of a kind of post-colonial evolution. I will probably find my way to back to prisons and museums at some point. The easy answer there is that the major powers built, well, the US, there's an arms race in both building types that echoes, David, your both the Cold War oppositions and, in fact, the current one seen more in terms of the United States and China. China is a remarkable country for a staggering prison population, if you include their sort of work-study model, and actually a burgeoning proliferation of museums in the last 25 years. And actually similarly in the UK, remarkable, the echo effect between East and West is I think, an interesting dynamic. But I would actually add, and this is why I kind of refrained from adding a fourth preamble and wanted to just sort of see where things were headed, because honestly I was so intrigued by the show. And it seemed to offer a model of post-colonial development and actually a certain form of really hands-on utopianism that I really appreciated, having lived a couple of years in Jakarta in 2015 and 2016. And living I think in any other country for a couple of years alters your take on, or alters your mode of architecturism. Still definitely a big part of why I was there and how I got intrigued with it. But I got really interested in fact, before we left for Jakarta, which was my partner is a diplomat, and this wasn't strictly my game plan heading there. But it's an incredible place, and an interest. I feel like every country emerging from a colonial history certainly does so in their unique ways, and that was part of why I felt like your exhibition and your focus on Ghana deserved that specificity. Briefly, in the Indonesian model, there's a radical rupture and declaration of independence after both the Dutch and the Japanese are expelled from the country after the Second World War. And 10 years ago, when I was better versed in it, I got very interested in the way they're rebuilding, built on what they call the 5 Panchasilas, the 5 basic principles of governance in Indonesia, and the degree to which those are a kind of brief sort of utopian template for how to rebuild the country, and how over 50 years that utopianism kind of changed character with different leadership. One thing as an American I was startled to learn as I spent a little more time there was that Sukarno and Suharto are absolutely different leaders, profoundly differently understood by the Indonesians. Sukarno, the leader of the independence movement, is considered really an incredible freedom fighter and the country's liberator, and as well as kind of the nation's architect in chief. He was trained as an engineer, and he started a whole series of incredible kind of grand projets, relaid out the city, reoriented of Jakarta. So there's the Sukarno period, and then he's followed by Suharto, about whom I think most of our concerns about Indonesian government are most closely tied to. He happened to actually be very U.S., well, he was against us before he was completely embroiled with us. But it was really tragedy becoming farce between those two kind of strong, military than civilian leaders. When I was there, and this is actually sort of my question, I'd like to, I'm sorry, Yusuf, I steer this a little bit, but part of what I was wondering as we were walking through your brilliant show was if there was a moment a little bit like the one I encountered in Jakarta, when I got to know some younger architects there and going around the world and just meeting people. I mean, every country sort of has its own demographic cycle and certainly histories that play out differently. The stunning thing about Indonesia is that young people in Indonesia view 1998 the way most of us would understand when anyone says 1968. That it was a moment of incredible breakthrough freedom. For the first time, they had a leader that wasn't a military strongman imposing his will, but someone at least more or less freely elected. And they view the creation of kind of a real contemporary and free Indonesian culture and new architecture in that light. And it means that their whole sense of the contemporary and what's possible, I think, is really different. I wondered, if you could flesh out your sense of how in Ghana, just the ebb and flow of, I mean, I think it seems like the utopian and prisons and museums were a tidy utopian and dystopian, actually, dystopian and utopian comparison for me. I have a feeling in almost every case with late modernism, you have a cycle. I mean, almost all architecture is imagined out of a utopian impulse to imagine something good and hope it gets built. And then often a dystopian devolution in terms of what actually happens or doesn't and who is responsible for that. But I'm wondering how those cycles developed as you put the show together.
Yeah, thank you. I think that it's a truly great analogy, a true great reference, Indonesia, because it also shows that this image that I think we quite often have, at least when we read the media, about the Cold War as a world divided into two halves is completely wrong, because precisely Indonesia was just like Ghana, a place under Sukarno, where the various forces would meet, right? So you would have Americans building Jakarta, but you would have also this fantastic stadium that was built by the Soviets at the same time, and there was also a very strong Chinese presence. So both places and so many others were in fact sites where the people experienced a kind of radical opening of the world beyond the former colonial metropole, whether that's Britain or that's the Netherlands, and they were kind of faced with that huge, I think, excitement and elan of that possibility, that discovery that the world is a huge place, and now they are part of it. And that also, again, came with huge risks that this opening entailed. They were working under pressure of delivery on independence and the promises of independence. They were working in a moment where their knowledge about the needs and the means was imperfect. They were working in a huge constraints of resources, including professional labor. And so, these two things came together, and I think what might be seen as utopian and dystopian, perhaps that is for me a way to look at this excitement, but also the risks, but also what is so compelling to me, and I think it's quite unique in case of Ghana for the 1960s, is the confidence that people are able to navigate and manage that situation, and that they are part of that broad world. And I think that in the wake of the 1966 coup and then the deteriorating political and economic situation in Ghana, and then the structural adjustments programs of the following decades, that confidence was lost, and perhaps not unsimilar to what you described, it is only recently that is recovered.
And speaking about risks, can you also explain a little bit how it was possible for those countries, both Indonesia and Ghana, to combine receiving support from the United States, the Soviet Union, and other parts of the world? How did they manage that, and did they come away with it?
Right, so this is a dynamics that has been discussed not only by historians but even by by the actors themselves. So, for example, you know, when Khrushchev goes to India, which is another one of these countries that was receiving resources from all sides, not just two, of the global Cold War, Khrushchev is telling Nehru that the fact that we are talking right now gives you leverage when you visit Washington next week, right? And so that was a dynamics that they were fully aware of. So I think that is one level. But I think there is also another one which has to do with, now specifically with architecture, and that's that shared culture of modernism, right? I think that is really important. And I want to stress one thing, which was also very evident for me when I was working through this archival material in, you know, these many countries, is that what came with modernism was not simply a claim to a universal solution. It was a claim that these solutions are adaptable. So, you know, adaptability was as much a kind of claim of modernist architectural culture as were these big ideas that travel across the world. And that is something that I'm very interested in, because adaptability that, you know, our architects quite often claim adaptability as sort of the core of the creative practice, how to, certainly at that time, how to adapt a modern solution and modern typology and modern technology to climatic conditions on the side. And what is striking to me that argument was made both by the British and the so-called tropical architecture movement of the late 1940s and the 1950s, and it was made by the Soviets, who pointed at, for instance, at Soviet Central Asia, Uzbekistan notably, Soviet Uzbekistan, as an example of how modern architecture from European parts of the Soviet Union were adapted to conditions that were climatically very differently and culturally very differently, notably they were shaped by Islam. And it is on that basis of Central Asian precedents that Soviet architects would argue, we did it in Central Asia, we can do it in Ghana too. And so that moment of adaptation, that modus of adaptation, was the way how with the confidence that I mentioned before, Ghanaian architects such as Adegbite were able to take from all sides.
Can you talk about how Ghana chose David Adjaye to develop an extraordinary program for modern development, and how that has fallen into the dystopian, utopian model in terms of planning?
Yes, I don't know if everybody is familiar with the office of David Adjaye, which is a major architectural office with, of course, several important buildings in this country, including in Washington, D.C. and in New York. And David Adjaye's office, which has also a branch in Accra, has become a really important contributor to the debate and to the ways how Accra is reimagining itself. That includes several large-scale projects in the city of Accra, including the Marine Drive on the seashore, but also parts of, if you remember the cover of my book, that's the International Trade Fair in Accra, and that is also a large area which is being master planned by the office and a couple of others. What is interesting to me, if I may, is that these places have the scale of urban intervention that returns to the scale of the 1960s. It's for the first time since the 1960s that large, an area of such a scale is being planned, which I think is quite remarkable and kind of also tells us something about the return to a certain model, or a certain model of architectural intervention. And also, I think, it testifies beyond doubt that the state is back as an actor in architectural production. Because, just as the state was behind these projects under Nkrumah, of course, at that time, as part of socialist modernization, the state is behind a lot of projects, probably most projects of David Ajay's office, and now, of course, in different formulas, public-private partnership. But nevertheless, the state is crucial. So I think this speaks to some of the comments that other contributors had about the sometimes surprising continuities with the 1960s.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, just to add what you're just saying, I think it's illuminating to see the logic of operations behind the authors, like David Ajay. So there's always been a strange mirroring that occurred in how devices of soft power were deployed in arts and architecture in the previous century, but an interesting mirroring that I see now is we'll have anxiety about the presidential order to have a federal architecture, et cetera. But amazingly, similar things are happening in China, where statements like "no more weird architecture," which was actually a directive to not be so obsessed with internationalism, but look towards China and Chinese cultural heritage. So it mirrors each other, and that I think is telling that why would both sides be doing the same thing, incorporating the same strategy at the same time? And that I think is something that escapes us a little bit. Yeah.
And following up on what you just said, of course, there is this tension nowadays between, on the one hand, the ongoing process of globalization and international dependency, but then obviously also the rise of right-wing populism, nationalism, xenophobia, etc. What role do you think can architecture play in dealing with this strange dynamic of the current period?
I mean, I'll make it really quick. Joe, like Lukasz, something that I find really odd is growing discourse in a kind of revised critical regionalism, which I thought was gone, but I see more and more people seriously picking up that discussion. Like, for example, with tropical modernism. Like, hey, this actually turned out to be pretty good. All this concrete turned out to be pretty good in the tropics, and maybe we should study more the building industry that grew around modernism, that we don't have to reverse course pre-modern, but we can look at the legacy of the modern contaminated period, maybe critically, and to revise. I don't know if that's, I don't know if I'm comfortable with this idea, but I just see it happening today. Yeah.
It does seem like that debate of contemporary polarization is also happening. It's happening all over the world in different ways, and in some ways, at least in my limited experience overseas, in a more kaleidoscopic way in places that are developing more quickly and with fewer historical constraints or senses of. It's funny, I thought critical regionalism was on my mind a little bit here, where my thought that if we're focusing on Ghana, let's stay there because not every case is the same. That every country is really its own situation, and to a certain degree, its own series of experiments. And one of the things that interested me in Indonesia was the polarization in that kind of experimentation. So I can say for sure, the way Western powers are having their say in the Indonesian landscape in this century is through mall construction. Malls are where people meet in a certain, malls are huge, and resorts now. The way Indonesia and Southeast Asia in general is being developed is worryingly fast-paced and ambitious, and an odd mix of local crony capitalism and Western multinationals that are good at getting those jobs. So there's an incredible mall, there are dozens of enormous malls that each one could contain all of our indoor malls in Los Angeles at a pack the Beverly Center, anything in Sanctuary City. You can get anything I can think of in LA into almost any of 6 big malls in Indonesia. One of them looks like an AI-generated play on the architectural vocabulary of morphosis. It's an incredible, that would be the Grand Indonesia. At least the upper floors of it, because they build these malls up and up and up, and the more recent wings of it are this incredible, almost kind of Piranesian play on idioms that seemed weirdly familiar to me when I arrived there.
Do you know who the builders are?
It's an alphabet soup of American corporate firms that get these jobs, and frankly, the kids probably that design them really would have preferred to be working for Tom. But they are, what you see are the kind of utopian projections, often of the West, not uniquely, often American, but certainly European as well. Honestly, David, I was reminded of it by the No More Weird Architecture. There's still quite a bit of weird architecture going on, and it is a strange and for some vastly profitable cultural crossroads. So I do think that's part of it. But I would add, kind of in a utopian vein that I really came to love more, the young architects I got to know, it was more like Dogma 95. The Danish film movement that decreed that films should be made within incredibly narrow and cost-effective parameters, only live sound. It was an incredibly reductive, strict set of rules that Danish filmmakers used in the 90s and early aughts to make some incredible films. The architects in Indonesia, the young ones, work like that. They'll spend 5 years collecting old teak from docks in order to build a house. They'll use it for the formwork, then they'll use it for everything else. They let, if it's in a palm grove, they'll let the palm trees come up through the house and do amazing things to gasket around them. There's an incredible, really inventive, honestly, again, it reminded me, a little bit of the Santa Monica School, and it's like a moment of incredible, or Basel at the turn of the century, a city with an incredible design culture of innovation where a couple dozen people all agreed that this was their situation and they were going to make the most of it. Passive cooling, a big.
That's
collector.
Jeffrey Bawa. A lot of that is.
Yeah, Bawa for sure.
Bawa.
As you go.
And
in fact,
Minette
they
de
were
Silva.
Huge hero to my friends, right. And they knew South Asian architecture with a kind of clarity. But they were a part of it. They were at our lecture at SCIARC on Wednesday. Sharon Johnstone and Mark Lee talked about the project in China in the early 2000s with 100 global architects that all built houses. It was a real watershed, and I first heard about that from my friend Danny Wakaksano, who I ended up teaching with in Singapore. But he had been there. He had great Ai Weiwei stories about how he would give everyone in his studio haircuts except the kids from Shanghai who could tell him no way. I don't know. It was such a vital.
Isn't it? It's also the Chinese architects who are doing adaptive reuse.
True.
And beautifully, amazingly, and MoMA had a terrific show a couple of years ago about that movement in China.
And I think you can't go to a school, in fact, I feel like at Michigan and at every school I visited in the last 2 years, a huge conundrum for teaching architecture right now in the big American schools is how do you teach adaptive reuse? Like, we are very accustomed to tabula rasa, to clearing a site and figuring out what to put in it next, and adaptive reuse is so much the norm in most of the world.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting that Elizabeth Diller has made so much of her career and her firm's career out of adaptive reuse and changing the nature of big urban parts of the city like the High Line and Lincoln Center.
Well, we're sitting in the fruits of it.
Yes, exactly. The LA version.
This is Justin's life mission if he's here somewhere.
I think that this conversation has a lot also to do between the three of you with the actual rethinking of modernism. So I think that we, perhaps modernism is back, but I think we also have a different understanding of modernism. And you know, we hope that with this exhibition we contributed to that. And the one single gesture here that we propose is to look at the long lives of the buildings, right? This is a kind of key contribution of the exhibition, that we are looking at the archival documents of Adegbite and Poloni and how they designed in response to the requirements of independence, mainly housing projects. But then we looked at the decades of the lives of these buildings. We commissioned a Ghanaian architect to document these daily practices of appropriation and rethinking. And I think that it is, for me as an educator, this is also a conceptual shift, that we are looking at buildings that last and that are being produced and co-produced and reproduced beyond the original architectural gesture.
Great thing about this discussion that I have absolutely nothing to do. And I think the reference to the long-term existence and relevance of architecture is maybe a good point to open it up for questions, for Q&A. So I think we have someone walking around. Julie, there you are. So please raise your hand if you have a question. We could have extended this discussion for hours, but yeah, I would also want to give you the chance to ask some questions. No questions? Ah, there's
I want to ask, I've got one on that Deco movie theater.
Well, I know that Susan was just in Palm Springs for Modernism Week, and so I'm really setting her up for this, but you had mentioned to me that there was Ethiopian influence, that you saw something in Palm Springs that blew your mind. So would love for you to share what you saw this past week there.
Thank you so much. I would like everyone to know that Palm Springs Modern is not about just Palm Springs Modern. In the last couple of years, it's become a really serious international focus on modernism across the world. And this year, World Monument Fund and Knoll gave their prize for the best modernist preservation project to the Africa Hall in Ethiopia, which was organized by the UN in the 60s for African nations to have a conference hall a la a small United Nations style modernist building where they could talk about the future of their countries. Many of these countries were colonial, were occupied colonial countries for a long time. And they felt that the countries should have a place where they could talk as Africa, as African nations, and not have to go outside the continent. And it's just been restored after 10 years. The idea is that it will, this kind of prize will focus on the need for the restoration, preservation of modernism. And this was done at Palm Springs Modern because there's such a terrific aggregate of people from all over the world going there to discuss the kind of issues that we're discussing, from the private house as the site of innovation in modernism to a forum for African architecture. So I recommend to all of you, if you can be involved with Palm Springs Modern and sample some of the book talks that they have. I was inspired to get involved in these issues from living in Los Angeles, under Griffith Park as an exiled New Yorker at that period, and got involved in trying to understand Los Angeles through the landscape and the modernist architecture. And that has led to all of my subsequent interest in international modernism.
Other questions? Yeah, there's one here.
I haven't quite formulated this into a question yet, but just kind of some thoughts that the conversation has inspired. When I'm thinking a little bit, there's an upcoming panel at SCIARC towards the newer brutalism commentary on that movement, but I'm kind of thinking also about this concept of like towards a new modernism or something like that. And yeah, there was something that got me thinking a little bit about Tom Metamorphosis' work on the Beirut embassy, right? And it's funny because Tom talks about he's really interested in the domestic, but yet there's this project going on. And I'm thinking a little bit, I recently read Ukash's work in radical pedagogies in Nigeria, and thinking a little bit about kind of the movement in '68, and also what does that mean as we kind of move towards maybe as what I heard suggested today as like a movement maybe similar to that isn't happening necessarily in the university, but maybe happening in this kind of exchange, cultural international exchange of younger architects and older architects. So yeah, it's not really a question yet, but I'm just thinking about kind of like these contexts and how that's moving today as we get something like a federal program towards specific types of architecture. But yeah, what is the response? I think I'm thinking about what the response of contemporary architecture is going to be to kind of like these movements. And as I'm hearing suggested, right, maybe it's through some kind of international exchange that is independent of or a grassroots response to kind of like these top-down structures.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks for the question, and I think I'm involved in that panel. It's based on an issue of a journal dear to architects called Log, called The Newer Brutalism that Emmett Zeitman put together earlier this year. And the research and interest in brutalism is honestly as curious to some architects as it must be to a lay audience, but it is definitely definitely in the air. And I'm glad you brought it up, or brought up at least, got us close to there, because of course the brutalist, the character in the film is nominally Hungarian. And it was interesting to me that this collaboration was with him. I have a standard line on The Brutalist, and my standard line on The Brutalist is, it is terrible history and really good theory. That as the film goes, brutalism evolved very differently from the way the film describes it. Any of the architects that might have been collaged into that story, frankly, it hews more closely to Louis Kahn's story after the First World War than it does anyone after the Second World War. Though Marcel Breuer is Hungarian and would fit some of the bill for some of it. It's just off base historically. But it is an interesting idea that brutalism should have been invented by a survivor of World War II, when in fact it was probably coined by people generationally kind of out of step with the fighting of World War II. But to me, and David, I feel like it touches on your question, what you said about formalism, and formalism carrying through the 20th century and indexing certain sways in power as much as it does. I mean, within architecture, formalism is art, it's the art for art's sake side of things. It's not supposed to be about power. It's supposed to be about pure form. But of course, it is that. Brutalism is in some ways one of the most formal, the most exuberant. Well, exuberant seems like a weird word with formalism. The most extreme versions of formalism. But I was thinking that in post-colonial architecture, the role of the more extreme modernisms, like brutalism, but even more consistently through the 20th century, expressionism, and the way expressionism gets deployed by different people to express their take, their take on what needs to be the expression of a country's identity or their own seems like an important marker as well. But
Just one quick comment about brutalism. First time I went to London and saw that great brutal building known as the Barbican, it was pretty shabby and not very nice. And then the second time I went to the Barbican 10 years later, it had become quite swanky and
the Yale
popular
Yale Art
with
and Architecture
young
did
people.
the same thing.
Yeah.
They need a postmodernist to clean them
It's
up.
definitely like a totally unexpected nostalgia and sentimentality towards that legacy, which I agree, I find it quite odd and unexpected.
I think the preservation organizations who are lobbying to have that done. I think it's C 20th Century in London, in England. They're very strong in their activism, and Docomomo International in the places. So the important brutalism. But Docomomo is a very interesting organization that was started about 40-something years ago, and it's about documenting architecture of the modern movement, which is another word for modernism. And they're actually having their 2026 Docomomo International conference at USC in a couple of weeks. And there so many of these examples of brutalism and also vernacular architecture across the world will be included. So to call attention to the ones like the Breuer building in Connecticut that was recently restored is worthwhile. It's not all worthwhile, but it's part of the attention.
I think what is really exciting about this moment is that we are not only rediscovering this architecture of the 60s and 70s, but we are, I think, really starting to read more carefully its contextual understanding, and that includes formalism. And I think, if you remember the building that I showed here, this is that round building. It seems like, at the first glance, it seems like a kind of iteration of very abstract forms, but in fact, it was coined as a very important strategy to negotiate the politics of Ghana of the 1960s. For Kwame Nkrumah, the president, who was developing the country towards socialism, the number one enemy that he identified was what he called tribalism, which is, the ethnic divisions in the country that directly resulted from the British system of colonial governance. And he was concerned about architecture that would directly speak to the ethnic cultures. So one of the strategies for von Nkrumah and for the architects around him would be to find a language that would both reverberate with the culture, but on a level that would not refer to direct ethnic culture, but for example, to the broadly speaking West African culture. And so that form that, again, architects whom I interviewed, who were both Ghanaian and Eastern European, who were involved in this project, they thought about this round building, which was called the Africa Pavilion, by reference to the form of an umbrella. Now, an umbrella is a form that is a symbol of power and prestige that is not specific to the Ga group or to the Ashanti or to the Ewes, but is an overarching model and symbol of prestige. And so this is just an example of how that language that appears purely abstract actually was conveying a very carefully calibrated message that, in this case, would oppose tribalism and yet would convey a pride of the West African culture.
I think there was another interesting aspect to your question, which is about this emerging network of young architects worldwide connecting outside the universities, and I don't know if one of you can comment on that.
Well, one thing it makes me consider.
Find their way to David's program.
Huh?
I said many of them find their way to your program.
Yeah, or to, I mean, there is a kind of diaspora in that respect too, you know, but one of the things that makes me think about is why can't you do it at the university? And so I do recognize that there are degrees of freedom outside the university that are not available in the university, and vice versa too, you know. I don't want to just, you know, trash university culture. I'm grateful that universities still exist. It's I don't know what else there is as a space of hesitation and contemplation today. But it is true that there are certain things about the logic of the university as we understand it today that precludes some of these maybe more activist or even merely ambitious urges that young people would have. That will obviously be counter to the logic of existing powers. Now, I don't know if the answer is social media, because like I said before, I don't know if that is such an emancipatory space at the end of the day, you know, but that's worth some discussion, maybe you with your colleagues, to maybe take a more active role in forming relationships like Poloni did when he decided to just go to Ghana. You know.
Just very briefly, I think this is true, but I even would see it in broader terms. It's not just about university education, but it's about inherited ways of understanding the profession. And I think this is a long discussion, and I know the discussion quite well because I studied the emergence of the architectural education in Western Africa. I know, you know, what exciting ideas there were, how the profession of the architect and its kind of corporate professional understanding was heavily criticized. But most of these countries are actually the first generation of architectural schools ended up with the RIBA model, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects model. And why is that? Why that's the case? That's an interesting story for another time. But I think what is relevant here is, and I'm very interested in the way how actually architects work and practice in Western Africa, who are the clients, and what are the models that make the practice viable. And one of the, I think, key references in this respect is the design and build model, which is one of the really interesting directions, not just for large offices, but actually for small and emerging offices too.
Yeah, I think it's important actually to touch on the utopian impulse in terms of schools, and especially schools of architecture have been founded out of an idea that there have to be better ways of living, we're going to figure it out. And there are a lot of, I mean, and maybe some of these will become schools, but I'm struck, David, by, in terms of what could bring people recently out of school but still getting up and running in the field, there used to be more active organizations like the LA Forum for Architecture and Urbanism, dear to my heart, but sort of, I think regrouping. The Architects League in New York would be this, but actually, honestly, Susan, I think a lot of the real enthusiasm, and it brings together not just architects, but preservationists and realtors, interestingly. Preservation is very much the banner for a lot of extracurricular gathering these days, at least, around here. But how much that scales or...
And the New York Review of Architecture, sure, and the LA version, which should be going on.
And the alternatives to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, frankly, yeah. I mean, we all hope some publications in general around art and architecture, anything cultural have been so embattled. I don't know. To leave, or my parting thought, and an optimistic one, is that I think what's happening with revival movie theaters and cinema is really, I went from prisons and museums to cinemas. These are all building types that have a lot to do with who gets to see what, when, and why. And architecturally, they're really governed by visual economies and sightlines that interest me. But there are all these small movie theaters. Quentin Tarantino bought a couple of them.
Right.
Idiots is now on our side of town and doing great
But
things.
it's
and
also
people
the
go.
architectural documentary that
True.
that gets attention.
True, and to that, I was thinking that in terms of post-colonial architecture and how to make sense of it, it's certainly through those works of remembrance that I think people will learn about it and start to make sense of it. There's a brilliant film about the Malamed dynasty in Israeli architecture that's really worth looking at. It was made by Yael Malamed as the granddaughter of the first of that family.
Right.
They're remarkable. I mean, her mother designed the
I saw that one. Yeah.
She does. Her mother designed the Supreme Court that really launched what protests there have been. But I bring it up in part to tie it back to to this story. Rem Koolhaas plays a really central role in understanding in the Indonesian story, or maybe more exactly, Indonesia played an important role in his story. The Koolhaases, Rem and his parents, moved to Jakarta when he was 8 years old. They were the first Dutch family invited back to Jakarta after the expulsion, because his father was a pretty progressive journalist who had somehow found his way into a dialogue with the Sukarno regime. The impact of that 2 years in Jakarta for Koolhaas echoes through contemporary architecture in 1,000 ways, and the most Danny, who I mentioned, Wakaksno, who I mentioned, he says that he learned English from watching Sesame Street, and he learned about architecture from talking his school into inviting Koolhaas back, and then driving him around the city for a week. And just, I think those personal, I think actually a lot of the answers to what feel like enormous conundrums in these situations has to do with personal rapport and where people go with it. The partnership that your exhibition describes is such an incredible, I presume there was a wonderful friendship at the heart of it. And I really do think that's what the arts and culture really have to offer the world at the end of the day. I think that is where
It's interesting to hear that Rem Koolhaas is the Sesame Street of architecture. With that optimistic remark, I think looking at the time, we have to conclude this really wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, all four of you.